today because we're going to look at the evidence for walking with God. But we have to decide, do we want to walk with God? There are people that will become Christians, put their faith and trust in Christ. They'll live somewhat of a Christian life, but they won't really walk with God. And of course, the Bible talks about when they stand before the beam of judgment, a lot of their works will be burned up because it will be things that were not from God. And so we can live our lives and have most of our works burned up, or we can live a life like Abram lived, that later we'll know as Abraham. And the interesting thing about it, so many times people will say, well, preacher, you don't understand. I mean, I'm in my 70s, I'm in my 80s. Well, I want to remind you that when we encounter Abram here in chapter 12, he's already 75 years old. Now, he's going to live another 100 years. He'll be the most productive century in all of history. That 100 years. But when we pick him up, we're going to see that he's already 75 years old. And the interesting thing about him is it would turn out to be, like I said, one of the most productive centuries. But he was already a very successful businessman. He was happily married to an extremely beautiful woman. His pedigree led back to Abraham. But listen to this pedigree. It was Adam to Seth to Enoch to Noah and Shem. Those were the ones that you could consider. Now, those are the righteous ones. Those are the ones who believed in God. Those are the ones who followed after God. So he had this, which gave him a great standing in the community. And even though he's highly respected, even amongst his servants, Abram's story begins with a poor, lost sinner. And he's hurrying down the road to a lost eternity when God breaks in and speaks to him. And when God speaks to him, it breaks down all that unbelief that he had. We're going to read this in several parts because we're actually going to look at chapter 12, verse 1 through 13, verse 18. I might want to lock the door so nobody gets out. They hear that many verses, and they're going to think this is going to be a long... We're going to be late for lunch. It's okay to be late for lunch because God is going to do something. Notice what he says here in Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. It says, Now the Lord said to Abram, Go from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to a land which I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those that bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So Abram went away as the Lord had spoken to him, yet Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed Haran. Abram took his wife Sarah and his nephew Lot and all the possessions which they had accumulated, and the people which was with them which they had acquired in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan. So when they came into the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem, at the oak of Morah. Now, the Canaanites were still in the land at that time. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, To your descendants I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Then he proceeded to where the mountain was on the east side of Bethel. He pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord. And he called upon the name of the Lord. And then Abram journeyed on, continued toward Negev, which Negev is that big desert at the southern part of Israel. First thing I want us to look at, the first steps of a man walking with God, verses 1 through 9. Because I want to remind you, so many times we look at Abram and Abraham, we look at him as, well, according to Romans, he's the finished work. It says he believed God and was counted him as his righteousness. That's the finished Abraham. What we're seeing is not the finished Abraham. We're seeing the new Abraham, the young Abraham here, that God's just now speaking to. You need to remember that Acts chapter 7, verse 2 through 4 tells us that God revealed through Stephen the promise that was made to Abram even when he was in Mesopotamia. When he dwelt in Haran, God had already spoke to him. In Genesis chapter 12, 1 through 3, it's a repeat of that. He's reminding him, this is a promise I've given to you. God repeats his promise now after his father had died. Abram's father had died, and Abram was compelled to be more obedient. I want you to notice here, we see a partial obedience. Because what does he tell him to do? He said, you go and take what you have and go. But leave your family and your relatives behind. It was just supposed to be him and Sarah, and they're supposed to go on their way. But he decided he's going to let Lot go with him. And that Lot is not going to be a blessing to the nations. Lot's going to be nothing but heartache and troubles and trials and tribulation. And even after Abraham gets him out of the mess, he gets right back in it. Because his heart was bent toward evil. And we're going to see that. So what are the first steps? Well, it's obedience. And you and I, sometimes we can be obedient. Sometimes we're not as obedient as we should be. Abraham certainly would become a giant of the faith, but right now he's not one. But according to Galatians chapter 3 and verse 7, when he started here, we know he's going to be an example, but he is a person growing in faith and growing in obedience. He was obedient, but he wasn't fully obedient. He did go, and he went where God told him to go, but he took some things with him he was not supposed to take with him, Lot being one of those things. So we see obedience, but it's partial obedience, which makes me ask myself the question, Ed, are you really being 100% obedient, or are you being 90% or 80%? Well, the interesting thing is, even though this was just partial obedience, I'm thankful that God didn't say, well, okay, Abram, you didn't complete what I asked you to do the way I asked you to do it and when I asked you to do it, so therefore I'm taking my promises back. He didn't. He delayed them. And maybe some of the promises that you've been expecting, that God's still going to fulfill those. He's just going to delay them. For example, the Canaanites were still in the land, and he says, I'm giving them to your descendants. It's going to take 400 years for them to get out of the land, for them to be totally run out, and for God's people to get the land. But God had promised it to him. He said, I'm giving it to your descendants. So maybe one of the reasons that we haven't been getting the blessings that God has promised is maybe we're not being obedient as we should be. Notice what he says here. He says, to a land where I will show you. After stating that he wanted Abram to leave the country and to take his relatives and leave them behind, God promised Abram a specific land. This is the place where he would call, what we would call Greater Israel. And this is what God said to him, Abram, I'm giving this to you. Not only is I giving this land to you, but this which you see with your physical eye. He said, this is what you will inherit. This is what I will give to your descendants. He says, and not only that, I will make of you a great nation. Now this is Abram learning to walk with God. He says, I'm going to make of you a great nation. God promised a nation out of Abraham. He would have children and grandchildren and future descendants. And even more than that, he had enough to make a great nation, a physical nation, with all his children. There's more than that. For you see, the Bible tells us that if we have the faith of Abraham, that we too are counted righteous. We are spiritual descendants. When you and I believe God, we are spiritual descendants of Abraham. It is much, much bigger than any of us can ever think or imagine. He says, but not only am I going to make a great nation of you, but I'm going to make a great name for you. God promised to bless Abram and make him a great name. By the way, I don't know of a name that is higher on earth to humankind than Abraham. Because the Jews, the Muslims, and the Christians all hold him up in high esteem because of his faith. He says, and I will bless them. We want to pay close attention to this. He said, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. What's God promising? God is saying, I promise you, those people who look after you and bless you, I will take care of them. However, those who curse you, I will curse them. Donald Barnhouse says, historically speaking, nations have treated the Jewish people well. They have often been blessed. When the Greeks, however, overran Palestine and desecrated the altar of the Jewish temple, they were quickly conquered by Rome. When Rome killed the Apostle Paul and many others, they destroyed the temple under Titus. Rome fell immediately. Spain was reduced to a fifth-rate nation after the Inquisition of the Jews. Hitler's Germany fell down and was broken after its anti-Semitism. And Britain lost her entire empire because she broke her covenant with Israel. Abraham, those who bless you, I will bless. You remember a few years back when the U.S. voted in the United Nations against Israel? They said, whoa, time out. We made a mistake. You better believe you made a mistake. Because God makes it clear. You want to go against Israel? Go ahead. You curse them, I will curse you. But maybe that's the problem with America today. Maybe we're under the curse of God because we haven't done with Israel what we should have done. This promise does affect the church. He says, in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now, I hope you'll underline that, because that's actually a missionary message right there. Notice what he says here. He says, in you, Abram, in you all those who are believers, those who are not believers, all the families, not just the believers, all. In you, all of the families will be blessed. Not only did Abraham get promised the blessing, but he says, I will make you a blessing. And by the way, this came to fruition when Jesus Christ hung on the cross. Because he's the one that through his blood at Calvary, he's the one who is a blessing to everyone. You realize that Jesus is a blessing to those who are believers. He's also a blessing to those who are lost. Jesus is a blessing to everyone, to all the world. And by the way, he did come through the lineage of Abram. God's blessing of Abram was not for his own sake, even for the Jewish nation, but it was for the whole world. Galatians chapter 3, verse 8 and 9 says, and the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel to Abraham before, saying, in you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And so even those who are of the faith and those who are not of the faith are blessed because of what Christ did 2,000 years ago. And Abraham was preached that same message. There's coming one. We're looking now as there has been one. Abraham was looking for the Messiah to come. We're looking at back when he did come. Revelation chapter 5 and verse 9 says, and they sang a new song, saying, you are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain and you have been redeemed us to God by your very blood, and every tribe and every tongue and every people and every nation. That's the missionary message. Why do you have a heart for missions? Because God has a heart for missions. I mean, he's telling Israel, I'm going to save you, I'm going to protect you, I'm going to bless you, but I'm going to make you a blessing. And to make you that blessing, you've got to go out and tell people. I hope your neighbors have been told. I hope you've told your neighbors and the people that you are with. But we've got to go further, because he says every nation, every tribe, every tongue. Martin Luther so accurately observed, he says, concerning this promise of you all nations and all the families of the earth will be blessed, he said it should be written in golden letters, and it should be extolled to all the peoples of the land. He said, for who else has dispensed this blessing among all the nations except for the Son of God, our Lord Jesus Christ? Martin Luther recognized, what is the blessing of the nations? He hung on a cross 2,000 years ago. But he was promised to Abram before that. This also indicates it's a missionary message, because it's intended to be a covenant to all the nations. God will bless all the nations of the earth through Abram, through Jesus Christ. Spurgeon said, there you see, there's the missionary character of the seed of Abram, even though they didn't recognize it. He said God did not bless them for themselves alone. He blessed them for all the nations. In thee, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Beginning in verse 4, look at where Abram departed. It says, so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him. And Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed Haran. It says Lot was with him. We see in Genesis chapter 12 and verse 1. He wasn't supposed to bring Lot. He was supposed to bring just his immediate family. Lot was never supposed to go. But as I said, especially as we go from now through chapter 19, we're going to see Lot be a headache and a heartache over and over and over and over again. Then in verse 5 and 6, look at Abram's arrival when he finally got there. So Abram took his wife and his nephew and all the possessions which they had accumulated, and the people that was with them they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. And when they got to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem. We want to keep Shechem in mind. Shechem and Bethel are two cities you want to keep in mind. He went to the oak of Morah. Now the Canaanites were still in the land at that time. Notice he says he got all the possessions, he got everything together, and they journeyed on. And they went all the way to Canaan. It says, so they came to the land of Canaan. Abraham was no stranger here. He was a pilgrim here. He would come to a land that was dominated, if you will, by a bunch of tribes of people who were violent, people who were sinful. Genesis chapter 34, 1 through 5 tells us just how bad the people of Canaan, the Canaanites, how bad they really were, and it's going to get worse. Adam passed through the land of Shechem. This was Abram's first stopping point, and notice what he did. At his very first stopping point, he built an altar. Everywhere he stops, as he journeys and stops, you're going to find Abram building a temple. Building an altar, because he wants to make sure that he worships God everywhere he stops. Now, why is Shechem so important? Because Shechem was where Jacob came safely after he returned from taking his wives and children, that sojourn, if you will, from Laban. That's in Genesis chapter 33. We'll see that. This is where Jacob bought that piece of land from a Canaanite woman named Hamor for 100 pieces of silver in Genesis 33. This is where Jacob built an altar to the Lord. He called it Elohim Israel. We will see that in Genesis 33. This established a connection between Jacob and what is known as Jacob's well. Shechem was a place where Diana, Jacob's daughter, was raped, and the sons of Jacob massacred all the men of that city in retaliation. We'll see that in Genesis 34. Shechem's important because this is the plot of ground that Jacob gave to his son Joseph, the land where Jacob conquered from the Amorites. We'll see that in Genesis 48. This is where the bones of Joseph would eventually be buried before they carried him up to Egypt in Joshua 24:32. This is where Joshua made a covenant with Israel, renewing his commitment to God by saying, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." Shechem's important. Shechem's New Testament name is Sychar. So when you get into Matthew and beyond, you start reading about Sychar, that's Shechem. Especially when you read in John chapter 4. And the Canaanites were in the land. They had it for 400 years, but God did as he promised. He didn't say, "I'm going to give it to you so you can put down roots." He said, "But I'm giving it to your descendants." They will. And they did. In verses 7 through 9, God appears again to Abram as he's in Canaan. The Lord appeared unto Abram and said, "To your descendants I will give this land." So he built an altar to the Lord, notice what this, who had appeared unto him, who had spoke to him. Then he proceeded from there to the mountain to the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent toward Bethel on the west, and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar. Again he's building an altar to the Lord who called upon his name. And Abram so journeyed on, continuing toward the Negev. That's that desert we talked about earlier. When it says that the Lord appeared to him, Abram was in the land already. He's reminded of the promises. He knows his descendants are going to get these. And even though he won't get to inherit that land himself, God gives it to him. But he's going to be a sojourner all the days of his life. I find it interesting that Abram never had a house. He always was in a tent. He was a pilgrim. He wasn't a vagabond. He was a pilgrim. You see, pilgrim's got a purpose. He's going somewhere for a purpose, and he was following God. He's looking for that city whose builder and maker is God. That's what he's looking for. His eyes are on that kingdom. They're not on this kingdom. We'll see that. He says, "Your descendants, Abram, I will give them the land." Abram never owned any land whatsoever except for the burial plot that he bought in Genesis chapter 23. And yet God's promises was enough evidence to assure Abram that God would carry out what God had said. You're not going to see it, but I'll promise you it's going to happen for your descendants. And Abram believed him. There he built an altar. Now I want you to look at this over and over and over as we go through Genesis, and while Abram's in the picture, you're going to see altar after altar after altar after altar. He's going to Bethel. He's coming back to Bethel. And Jacob will do the same thing. Why? Because the altar is important. I'm afraid we've forgotten how important the altar is. The altar was important because that's where he met God. The altar was important because that's where he sacrificed for his sin. That's where he submitted himself to God. And that's where he worshiped God. I have to ask myself the question, how important is an altar to us? This is an amazing altar. And every week I give an invitation to come and to lay your burdens and your sorrows. And very, very seldom does it ever get used. Maybe we're just such good Christians that we don't really need to confess our sin because it's so minute that we really don't need to come to the altar. Maybe we've sacrificed so much already. Maybe we don't need to give God a sacrifice of coming down. And by the way, we're supposed to give a sacrifice of praise also. That's why I wanted to do the doxology. That's just one more way of saying, you are who you said you are. And you alone are worthy of all praise. To Abram, the altar was the most important thing because that's where him and God spent time together. Christians have an altar also, according to Hebrews 13:10. That's where we meet God in our own place to sacrifice, remembering what Jesus has done for us. Romans chapter 12, verse 1 tells us that we are to offer our bodies as living sacrifices. God deserves that. It also says in Hebrews 13:15 that we are to offer a sacrifice of praise. Well, preacher, if you just know how bad things were going in my life, it doesn't matter how. See, this is a good thing about God. It doesn't matter how good things are going or how bad things are going. God is always there with you, and He deserves praise and adoration. Notice it says He pitched His tent. The word pitched His tent here, it literally means to open your door. He pitched His tent toward the temple. Every time that Abram opened his tent door, the back of his tent was against the world. The front of his tent, when he opened it up, he would see that temple. He would see that altar that he had built. And all he had to do was walk down to his altar. That ought to tell us a little bit about his attitude, who he was. He pitched his tent. He wasn't a pilgrim he was a pilgrim because a pilgrim leaves home with a specific destination, the destination that God had given. His goal was to eventually reach that heavenly city, which he's done. According to Hebrews chapter 11, 8 through 10, he has done that. But that does chapter 12. Now let's do chapter 13. Chapter 13, be quick, don't leave. We will read the first 18 verses and we'll keep it all in context. Beginning in chapter 13, you want to know how to walk with God, this is going to tell us right here. If you really want to walk with God, we're going to pull it apart right here. It says, so Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, to the desert. He and his wife and all that they belonged, and Lot was with them. Now Abram was very rich in livestock and silver and gold, and he went on the journeys from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been from the beginning between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar where he had made there previously. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who was with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. And the land could not support the both of them while living together. For their possessions had become so great they were not able to remain together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanites and the Perizzites were living in the land at that time. And Abram said to Lot, please, let there be no strife between you and me, or between our herdsmen and our other herdsmen, for we are relatives. Is not the entire land before us? Please, separate yourself from me. If you choose left, then I will go right. If you choose right, then I will go left. Now, I want to remind you, God had already given it to Abram. And he may let Lot occupy it, but it still belongs to Abram because God gave it to him. We'll see that later. Verse 10. Lot raised his eyes and saw the vicinity of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere, and it was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Like the garden of the Lord. In other words, this was a plush place. It would have been a great place to live. He said it was like the land of Egypt going into Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the vicinity in the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. So they separated one from another. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled with the cities of the vicinity in Jordan, and he pitched his tents towards Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were exceedingly wicked sinners before the Lord. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, now raise your eyes and look from all the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. And all of this land which you see I will give to you and your descendants forever. I will make of your descendants as plentiful as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone were to count the dust of the earth as your descendants, they could also be counted. Arise and walk about the land through its length and its width, and I will give it to you. Then Abram moved his tent. He came and lived by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron. And there he built an altar to the Lord. That's 3 altars in 3 different locations. So what are the characteristics? You want to learn how to walk with God, you need to have these 3 characteristics. The characteristic of a man who walks with God, we're going to see in those first 4 verses. We need to remember that Abram had followed God to Bethel, built an altar there. However, the famine had driven them down into Egypt. Now they come back out of Egypt. And now Abram begins his journey out of Egypt. And he's committed himself. He's grown in his process. He's no longer being partially obedient. He is now becoming fully obedient. Well, how did he do that? There's three things it takes. If you want to walk with God, the characteristics are this. Number one is separation. Number two is sanctification. And number three is sacrifice. If we want to really walk with God, there has to be separation. Notice that Abram separated his family from all the ungodliness. And today there is an ever-increasing need for believers to separate themselves from worldliness. This world hates God. They hate the Lord Jesus Christ. And truth be known, they hate you if you believe. And we need to separate ourselves from them. So how do you do that? How do you separate yourself from it? You don't participate in the things that they participate in. So separation. Have you separated yourself? And are you separating your family from worldliness? Not only separation, but sanctification. Now, I'm not talking about isolation. I'm not saying you need to go buy a plant farm over here and build you a 100-foot wall and only you and your family go in and you've isolated yourself from them. But I'm talking about insulation. You see, the difference is insulation. You insulate your heart so that the world doesn't affect you. You need to affect the world doesn't need to affect you. And sanctification is a pulling away from something and a pulling to something else. And with Abram, and it should be with us, he was pulling away from the world and pulling toward God. Because everywhere he went, the most important thing in his life was that altar. Because that's where he met God. And that's where we met God. But not only separation and sanctification, but sacrifice. Notice what it says, unto the place of the altar. That's what was important to him. Abram's tent reflects his attitude toward this world. He put his back to it. I don't care what's going on behind me. I don't care what's happening in the world. That's behind me. But notice he says his reflection is his attitude for the next world. The reason he knew the altar was important is God had promised him so many things. He was looking forward to the day when he would stand before God as being righteous through the shed blood of Jesus Christ through his faith. He was looking for that day. That's why he had his opening toward the altar. When you go to the altar of the Lord, it calls for a sacrifice. Think about what David said, great king of Israel. I refuse, and when he says I refuse, he means I utterly refuse. No question about it, no possibilities. I utterly refuse to offer anything to God that has not cost me. Now, if that's the king of David, if that's his heart, that'll be our heart too. How dare me offer God something that doesn't cost me? If we're ever going to walk with God, it will require separation and sanctification and sacrifice. The second thing is the concepts, not only the character of walking with God, but the concepts of a man who walks with God. We see that in verse 5 through 9. Pay close attention to the difference between Lot and Abram. In 5 and 6, we see the circumstances. Now, Lot went out with Abram. Also, they had flocks and herds and tents, and the land would not support them. So they, while they were living together, they took all the possessions. They were so great, they could not remain together anymore. It led to contention in verse 7. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's flock and the herdsmen of Lot's flock. Now the Canaanite presence were living in the land, which led to, notice the compassion Abram has here. A circumstance has arisen, there's been contention, and now there's compassion on Abraham's part, or Abram's part. So Abram said to Lot, do you see the humility here? Please, let there be no strife between you and me. Knowing God's already given it to me anyway, he could have said, this is mine. You're lucky I brought you along. But he didn't. Don't want there to be any contention between us or our herdsmen, for we are relatives. We're kin. Well, that's what the church could use today. There should be no contention. If there's contention between any of us, we've got a problem, for we are relatives. But then look at the condition in verse 9. He says, is the entire land not before you? Lot, you got to pick. You go left, I'll go right. You go right, I'll go. It's all you choose. You see the humility that's there. Abram laid aside his rights for all the land in a sacrificial offering to a spiritual brother. Perhaps it's time for some of us to lay aside our sacrificial offerings for a brother or sister in Christ. Verses 10 through 18 tell us the course, and this is important. The course of the man who walks with God. Do we really want to walk with God? We need those characteristics. We also need to look at the course. Lot was spiritually dead. He lacked discernment. He had wealth and flocks and herdmen and tents, but he had no altar. Did you notice that? He didn't even go to Abram's altar. Let's build one for himself. You see, he was too enticed by the world. We'll see that in a minute. Look at verse 10. Lot raised his eyes and saw the vicinity of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It was like the garden of the Lord, and like the land of Egypt coming out of Zoar. It was like both. What is he saying here? Egypt appealed to Lot because it was just like Sodom and Gomorrah. Egypt was. Lot's desires were worldly. He desired Sodom, but he also saw God's blessings on the valley of the Jordan. He wanted both. In other words, he wanted his cake and eat it too. He wanted the best of both worlds. How many people have you heard say, well, I want to live I want to live my life out until I'm a certain age. At a certain age, I'm going to give my life to Jesus. Usually that's on up in age. Usually, if you're 16, 18, 20, 30 years old, well, when I get in my 70s or when I get in my 80s, I'll give what's left over of my life, I'll give it to God. It doesn't work that way. That's what Lot wanted. I want Sodom and Gomorrah, but I also want this over. I want the blessings of God in my life, but I want Him to give it to me in spite of how I act, in spite of how I live. That's what Lot was saying. Abram says, Lot, you choose. It's your choice. It says, while Abram pitched his tent toward Bethel, and Lot pitched his tent toward Sodom. In verses 14 through 18, we see God blesses Abram. Even though Abram allows Lot to have the portion of land, God reminds him, Abram, you can let it live there, but I want to remind you, I gave it to you. It belonged to him. Look what he said in verse 17. Abram, arise, and walk about throughout all the land with its length and its width, for I will give it to you. Then Abram moved his tent. He came by the oaks of Mamre, which is in Hebron, and there he built an altar to God. Abram walked with God, and when God commanded him, he walked in obedience. At first he was stumbling because he was doing some things wrong, but now we see a mature Abraham. How do you walk with God? By doing exactly what Abraham did. We've got to grow into it. We can't wake up tomorrow morning and go, oh, man, I'm walking with God today. It doesn't work that way. I wish it did. It'd be great. But if we want to walk with God, we've got to apply these things to our life. And the most important thing to us as Christians is, if it's not an altar, what is it? What is more important than an altar? Abram built an altar for sacrifice every single place he stops. And as we go through Scripture, you'll see he does it again. But you know what I find interesting? God alters the course of those who walk with him. God does. He alters the course. You may be going down this road and God says, okay, it's time to move. Take the tent up and let's move. We're going a different direction. God does those things to you. And sometimes you don't know why in the world he does it. He just does. But he's got a reason. He's got a plan. He's got a purpose. So do we really want to walk with God? If we want to walk with God, just want to kind of summarize this to remember. Remember the character of a man who walks with God. Separation, sanctification, and sacrifice. How are you doing? Are you living a life separated from this world, or are you so in tune with this world that you want even more of it? What about sanctification? Have you turned your back on the world and tried to apply that principles to the way you live your life for Christ? The character. But also it takes the concepts. The concepts is humility and being unselfish. Abram, there's no way you cannot accuse him. You can't accuse him of being insincere in any shape, form, or fashion, because he was a man of humility and he was unselfish. Even though God had given it to him, it was his. He said, Lord, I'll let you live all your days on it. And then the course. The course has to be when God speaks, we move. When God says something, we have to respond in obedience. So the question I have to ask you is, has God altered your course? If God hasn't altered your course, you might want to ask why. Because God does alter courses. I mean, if you think about Abram, he's out there in Ur of the Chaldees, and all of a sudden God speaks to him. And totally, radically changed his life. To where even here we are, almost 6,000 years afterwards. And we're still talking about it. A man who actually walked with God, just like Enoch, his great-great-great-great-grandfather, walked with God. Do you want to walk with God? It's possible, but that's what it's going to take. Part of the whole process is the renewing of our mind, because our mind determines a lot about what our body does. And Paul makes it clear that we are supposed to renew our mind. How do you do that? Read your Bible, pray, come to God's altar, get things right with God. You can do it at home, but why in the world would you, if this was built for the purpose of you being able and me being able to get right with God, what is it that's different about Abram that's different from us? Should be nothing. We should be just as eager. We should pitch our tent toward the altar. Every head bowed, every eye closed. If you're here with us today and you've never truly